The cold slipped in before I'd even taken my first step inside the kind that cuts straight through denim and settles in your bones. The garage lights struggled awake, one by one, throwing long, uneven shadows across the floor. I could feel the day watching me, waiting as if it knew something I didn't. Nebraska mornings have a silence of their own. Not peaceful, not comforting. Just the kind that leaves too much room for a man to hear the things he's tried to ignore. Out on the street, nothing moved. Not a truck, not a dog, not even the wind dared to speak. It was the kind of stillness that tells you life is about to turn in a direction you didn't plan for. I hung my coat on the old hook by the door, the same one I'd used for 2 decades, and caught my reflection in the dusty window. A man shaped by routine. A man no one expected to change. A man my own family had already written off as someone who'd grow old with only machines and sons to keep him company. But that morning the air felt charged, restless, almost brittle. The heater groaned in a way I'd never heard before, and the scent of cold metal hung heavier than usual, like the world was holding its breath. Looking back now, I can see it clearly. Everything in that room was trying to warn me, because within 24 hours a single envelope, a single sentence, and a single truth long buried were about to pull my quiet life into a storm my family never thought I'd survive. The first sound of my morning was the steel door of the garage lifting itself awake. It always groaned the same way, as if it resented the hour. The street outside was still empty, the kind of empty that belonged to small towns before sunrise. I stepped inside, reached for the switch, and let the fluorescent lights warm the cold concrete, one slow flicker at a time. People in Caldwell had grown used to seeing that ritual. 6 in the morning, truck parked in the same spot, tools arranged the same way, machines. Waiting for a pair of hands that had been fixing things longer than most of the kids in town had been alive. In their eyes, I was the quiet brother, the one who lived in a modest house on the edge of town, 48 and steady as a fence post. A man they assumed would grow old alone because nothing ever seemed to change around him. That morning before the funeral lunch, I found myself staring at an old photograph pinned above my workbench. It showed my father leaning against a tractor and me standing beside him, maybe 16 or 17, holding a wrench too big for my hand. The photo had gathered a thin film of dust. I brushed it off and felt something small shift inside me. A reminder that life had moved once, even if no one remembered. The church hall was full by the time I arrived. The smell of casseroles hung heavy in the air. The kind of smell that wrapped itself around every funeral in our county. People lined up with paper plates offering the same short phrases they had offered at every funeral since I was a boy. "You hold up fine now. She was proud of you, boys. She is in a better place." I nodded and thanked them and kept moving. David and Brian sat near the front. David spotted me first and raised 2 fingers off his cup in a half wave. Brian gave a small smile, the kind that never showed teeth. I pulled out a chair, pressed the legs into the floor so it would not squeal, and sat with them. For a moment, none of us spoke. Grief can do that, settle in a room like a heavy coat no one wants to take off. But David never liked silence. He leaned back, glanced at me, and said loud enough for the nearest tables to hear that at least one good thing about me living alone was that the house would not feel any different now that Mom was gone. Someone laughed. Someone else coughed. The pastor lowered his eyes as if he had not heard. Brian reached across and touched my arm, saying I always liked my peace and quiet anyway, as if that softened the sting. I managed a smile. Years of being the eldest had taught me how to keep a room steady. I told them I had noticed Mom was gone the minute the call came in at 2 a.m., and that quiet did not make loss any easier. They let the moment drift away as if nothing sharp had been said. Talk shifted to business, the farm, the 400 acres west of town that had been in our family for 3 generations. David leaned in and lowered his voice, but not enough. He talked about a logistics company out of Omaha, long-term development, steady money, a chance to modernize. Brian nodded and threw in a few thoughts about traffic and opportunity and what the deal could mean for Caldwell. No one mentioned that the deed had been in my name since Dad died. No one looked at me when they spoke about decisions, signatures, timelines. It was as if I were a piece of furniture at the table, solid and quiet, something to work around. It was not the first time I had felt that way. My brothers had a habit of planning without me, assuming I preferred tools over conversations, engines over human company. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes they simply found it convenient to believe they were. After we finished eating, people began to gather their coats. That was when I felt a light touch on my elbow. I turned and saw Jenna Ruiz from the county clerk's office standing behind me. Her smile was polite, but her eyes were serious, almost apologetic. She asked if I could step into the hallway for a moment. The hallway was dim and quiet, a relief after the noise. Jenna held a small yellow envelope with my name written in my mother's cursive. She said Mom had left it at the clerk's office months ago with instructions that it was to be given only to me and only after her death certificate was filed. Jenna hesitated as if unsure whether she should be the one handing it over. Then she placed it in my hand and told me she was sorry for my loss. The envelope felt unusually light. I opened it carefully and unfolded the lined paper inside. My mother's handwriting filled the top line. If you are reading this, it means your father's secret has surfaced. There was nothing else. No explanation, no farewell, nothing. The bottom of the page was blank, as if she had run out of courage or time. I read the line again, hoping new meaning would appear. It did not. When I stepped back inside, Sheriff Howe was slipping on his coat by the door. I told him about the note, expecting something simple in return. Maybe a memory of Dad, maybe a hint. Instead, he stopped moving. His face tightened, not with grief, but with recognition. He told me quietly that every man had a secret or two, especially men who lived through hard seasons. Then he changed the subject to the weather and asked if I needed anything on the drive home. The shift was too fast. It felt like watching someone close a drawer with something fragile inside. People began to leave. David put a hand on my shoulder and said we would talk soon about getting everyone on the same page about the land. Brian told me the house might feel strange for a while, but that I was used to quiet. I nodded and let them believe whatever they needed to believe. Driving back into town was like moving through a memory I could not quite place. The grain elevator, the diner, the water tower with its chipped blue paint, all familiar in a way that made my chest ache. I pulled into the alley behind my garage, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the cooling tick of the truck. Inside, the shop welcomed me with its usual scent of oil and steel. I switched on the lights and the room brightened slowly. The machines sat silent, waiting for hands that knew their stories. I set the envelope on the workbench beside the old photograph and smoothed the creases out of the paper. My mother's sentence stared back at me, stubborn and unfinished. The more I looked at it, the more I felt something shift inside me, subtle as a wrench turning in a rusted bolt. I thought about the way my brothers talked over me, the way the sheriff hesitated, the way my father had chosen my name for the deed without offering a reason. For years, I had accepted the quiet around me as something natural, something chosen. But standing in that small concrete room, I began to wonder if the quiet had been placed over me instead. One assumption at a time. I studied the note once more, then let out a slow breath. Somewhere in the space between that single sentence and the way my brothers ignored me at the table, a truth was taking shape, faint but certain. I looked around the garage at the tools hung in perfect lines at the engines I could fix with my eyes half closed, and felt the first stirrings of a different kind of sense. Not the kind I inherited, the kind that precedes movement. I whispered the question that had been rising in me ever since the funeral lunch. What did you two hide from me all my life? The garage held the same stillness the next morning, but it was not the quiet I knew. This one felt cautious, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what I would do with the truth I had whispered into them the night before. I switched on the lights and listened to their slow hum filling the corners of the room. The air smelled colder than usual, metallic and sharp like the hours before a storm. I set a pot of coffee on the old burner in the back. The steam rose in thin gray ribbons. I watched it drift for a moment, trying to steady the thoughts pressing behind my eyes. I was wiping my hands on a rag when I heard tires crunching over the gravel. Not the familiar sound of customers. A heavier tread. A truck that did not belong here this early. David stepped out before the engine even shut off. He walked in without knocking, a manila folder clutched tight in one hand. He moved with an urgency he was trying to hide, the same way he used to hurry through excuses when he was a boy. He set the folder on my workbench and kept one hand on it as if afraid I would push it away. He told me the family needed to move forward. He said everyone was tired. He said this whole process could be simple if I just signed. His voice was calm, but his eyes flickered in small, nervous shifts, watching my hands, not my face. I opened the folder. The pages were crisp, too new to be old family business. Typed sections marked where I should initial. Notes in the margins written in a hand. That was not mine. I let the silence stretch long enough that he had to feel it. If this was harmless, I asked, why did Dad never sign it while he was alive? The question landed between us like a dropped wrench. David froze. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again with half-explanations that folded into nothing. He said Dad hesitated. He said Dad forgot. He said it was complicated. All of it sounded rehearsed, but not well. I closed the folder. I told him I would review it. Nothing more. A simple sentence, steady and low. For a man like David, it was enough to shake something loose. His shoulders tightened. He nodded too quickly. When he left, he did not meet my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I watched my younger brother walk away from me, instead of past me. After the door shut behind him, I carried the folder to the drawer where I kept the things that mattered. I slid it in, turned the small key at the edge, and felt a quiet resolve settle in my chest. I had spent years letting things drift around me. That morning, I chose not to. I tried to return to work, but found myself standing still more often than I moved. The weight of the folder lingered in my mind. I stepped outside a moment, letting the cold air fill my lungs. The sky hung low, a winter gray, and the fields beyond town stretched in a quiet that pressed against the edges of my thoughts. By late morning, I drove to the county building. The scent of old paper and copier toner met me as I walked in. Jenna was sorting files behind the desk and looked up as soon as I approached. Something in her expression shifted when she saw the documents I laid down. She asked me to follow her into the side room where the fluorescent lights hummed above the copier. She studied the pages carefully, her eyes narrowing with each scan. When she finally looked at me, her voice had dropped into something measured. The plat these papers referenced had been voided in 20. The original documents had disappeared from the archives. Not lost, removed. The words landed heavier than she intended. Things like that did not just happen in Caldwell. Someone had made sure those records were gone. I thanked her and walked out into the cold afternoon. Snow clouds gathered in thick layers overhead. I could feel the weight of the sky as I drove to the lumber yard to pick up supplies. The smell of fresh cut wood curled through the aisles as I walked between stacks of boards. Brian found me there. He moved quickly as if he had been waiting for me. His breath came out in short white bursts. He checked over his shoulder before speaking. Just sign, Elias. His voice cracked slightly. Things could get messy if you do not. I asked him what kind of mess he meant. He shook his head and said it was better I did not drag this out. There was a tremor in his hands he tried to hide in his pockets. Then he walked away, leaving his words hanging between rows of cedar and pine like a warning no one wanted to say out loud. On my way back into town, I saw Sheriff Howe parked near the old grain road. He lifted his hand in greeting and I pulled over beside him. He unscrewed the lid of his thermos and stared out at the empty winter fields. I told him about the papers, about how they wanted me to sign. His face did not change, but something behind his eyes did, a quiet shift. He said my father once told him that I was the only one he trusted when the wolves came. His voice carried the weight of something he did not want to finish saying. I asked what he meant. The sheriff looked at the horizon for a long moment, then told me it was probably nothing. He put the lid back on his thermos and told me to take care on the roads. Then he left the gravel spitting out from under his tires like sparks. When I returned to the garage, the light had thinned into late afternoon. The shadows grew long on the concrete floor. I walked straight to the corner where my father kept his old fire safe. The metal felt colder than usual as I knelt and spun the dial. The door opened cleanly, too clean. The inside was stripped bare. No documents, no envelopes, no trace of what had been there for decades. Someone had opened it recently. Someone had taken their time. I rested my hand on the edge of the safe. For a moment I could almost feel my father's hand over mine the way he used to guide me when I was a boy learning how to open it. The memory passed like a breath, sharp and gone. I stood slowly and opened the drawer beside my bench to look for any clue of what had been removed. That was when I found the business card, Crisp Edges, a name I recognized from Omaha, an attorney who specialized in elder law. The intent behind that card was clear. Someone had been considering how to question my capacity. Someone had wanted me out of the way long before they asked for my signature. I set the card on the workbench beside the folder and the empty safe and stepped back. The garage was quiet except for the faint hum of the overhead light. Dust drifted through a thin beam of sunset, turning in the stillness like slow-moving ash. In that quiet, something inside me settled into place. A truth heavy and certain. This was not about inheritance. It was about someone covering a path they hoped I would never find. The light flickered once soft and brief, and the room went still again. The kind of stillness that waits for the next move. The hum of the light above the bench stayed with me long after I turned it off that night. By the time morning came, the garage felt tighter, as if the walls had inched closer while I slept. The air carried that mix of dust and cold metal that comes after a hard frost. I unlocked the door, let the light spill across the concrete, and tried to move like every other day, slow and steady, one tool at a time. A pickup pulled in not long after the engine, a little too loud for this hour. I knew the sound before I saw the truck. Cole Jenkins, 24 National Guard, all edges and good intentions, a kid who had grown up in the same county but on the newer side of town. He had started dropping by on weekends months ago, asking if he could help around the shop. Said he liked working with his hands, said it cleared his head. He stepped through the door, pulled off his cap, and nodded at me. His cheeks were red from the cold. He asked if there was anything he could do. I told him the truth. The back shelves had not been touched since my father was alive. They needed more than dusting. We went to the far wall where a rusted metal shelving unit leaned into the cinder block like it had given up standing on its own. Old parts crowded every shelf, belts and hoses and boxes of bolts whose labels had faded a long time ago. I took one side. Cole took the other, and we began to lift and slide it just enough to get behind. The metal scraped across the floor, a slow, harsh sound that echoed in the quiet. When we pulled the shelf out from the wall, something small and solid dropped to the concrete with a dull clank. Cole bent down before I could. He picked up a box about the size of a lunch pail, the surface streaked with rust, a thin line of dust marking where it had sat undisturbed for years. He turned it in his hands, then looked at me. There was no lock, just a lid that stuck for a second before giving way. Inside was a folded cloth stiff with age. Cole peeled it back. Lying in the center was a microcassette, the clear plastic yellowed slightly at the edges, a strip of tape visible through the window. He held it out to me with both hands, the way someone holds something that does not belong to them. On the label in my father's handwriting was a date from 2008, 3 days before the tractor rolled on him in the west field. I took it and felt how light it was. Funny how little weight a voice needs to travel through time. In the small office at the back of the garage, an old tape recorder sat on a shelf beside manuals and coffee tins. My father used to record notes for jobs that took more than 1 day. I had not touched the recorder in years. I wiped off a layer of dust, opened the compartment, and slid the cassette into place. Cole hovered in the doorway, not sure if he should stay. I told him he could finish sorting bolts. My voice was neutral, but he heard the boundary in it. He nodded and stepped back into the main bay. The machine clicked when I pressed play. For a second there was only static, then the sound of my father breathing. It came through thinner than I remembered, but the rhythm was the same. Then his voice rose steady and slow, carrying that old mix of gravel and patience I knew better than my own heartbeat. He spoke about the farm. He spoke about the years it had carried our family. He spoke my name in a way that made something in my chest pull tight. He said that if anyone ever tried to push me off that land, there was something I needed to be told, something I needed to remember. The tape cut off before he finished the sentence. A heavy thud came through the speaker, then nothing but static. No goodbye. No explanation. Just the start of a warning that never reached its end. I sat there with my hands still resting on the recorder. The room seemed smaller. The quiet after his voice felt heavier than any sound. I rewound the tape, listening again. Same breath, same words, same sudden sense. A message cut short. Cole appeared in the doorway again, moving slowly as if not wanting to break whatever spell the room held. He asked if everything was all right. I told him it was just my father, and that was enough to make him step back and give me space. By mid-afternoon, I was sitting in the front room of a small house on the edge of town. Lace curtains framed degrees on the wall that had started to fade. Lorraine Campbell had been our family attorney for as long as I could remember. She had retired a few years back, but her mind had not. She sat across from me, the recorder on the table between us. She listened to the tape once, without moving, eyes fixed on the machine. When it clicked off, she pressed rewind and listened again. The second time, her shoulders lowered a fraction. When the thud came and the static took over, she reached out and turned the recorder off herself. She looked at me then. Her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "This is not about property, Elias. This is about why your father chose you." I felt the chair under me, the ground beneath that. The whole line of weight going down into something I could not yet see. I asked her what she knew. She hesitated, torn between old loyalties and the man sitting in front of her. She said that some things were not hers to say. Then she paused, reconsidered, and suggested I talk to the sheriff again. Her eyes held mine longer than her words did. It was enough. The sun was low when I found Howe again. Same truck, same stretch of road near the fields. Different day, different silence. He watched me walk up, then turned toward the open land as if he needed the horizon to steady himself. I told him about the tape. I told him my father had been in the middle of warning me when someone or something cut him off. I told him I was done pretending that all of this was coincidence. For a while he said nothing. The only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass at the edge of the ditch. Finally he spoke, eyes still on the fields. Your mother came to see me in 2005. She had found papers in your brother's truck, loan documents, casino statements, the farm listed as collateral, the whole thing. He went on. My father had stepped in, paid off a debt that could have taken everything. $1.4 million pulled from accounts I had never known we had. He had done it quietly on the condition that your mother keep it buried and that David never put the land at risk again. The sheriff finally looked at me. Your father put the deed in your name after that, not to cut your brothers out, to keep the land away from anyone who might see it as a way to fix their mistakes. The words hit in waves. The image of my father sliding papers across a bank desk came back to me. But now it carried a different weight. He had not simply been passing a torch. He had been building a wall between the land and the worst parts of his own son. I thanked Howe. There was not much else to say. He nodded once and climbed back into his truck. When he drove off, the sound of the engine faded quickly, leaving only the wind and the low hum of power lines overhead. Night settled hard over Caldwell that evening. The garage windows turned black, reflecting the inside back at me. I locked up earlier than usual and sat in my truck for a while, hands on the steering wheel, headlights off. The town lights glowed a dull yellow down the street, small islands in the cold. Back at the house, the kitchen was too quiet. I made coffee I did not need and let it sit untouched on the counter. The cassette lay on the table. I turned it over in my hand. Feeling every ridge of the plastic, the worn edge of the label where my father's thumb must have passed. My phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, I listened. The voice was low and disguised, strained through something that distorted the edges. It said my name. It told me to stop digging. It said some secrets were not safe to touch. The message ended there. No threat spelled out, no name attached, just enough to land like a weight on an already loaded scale. I set the phone down and picked up the cassette again. In that small piece of plastic lived my father's unfinished sentence. The start of a warning that hung over everything like heavy sky. I stood by the window, tape in hand, and watched the dark fields beyond the town lights. Somewhere out there years ago, a tractor had turned over and taken his voice with it. What remained now was this fragment cut short, pointing toward a truth I could feel more than see. The house was quiet, too quiet. I held the cassette a little tighter, felt the storm building at the edge of things, and understood that whatever my father meant to tell me, I had only heard half of it. The house settled around me after that message, the way old wood does when the night deepens. I set the cassette on the counter and let my hand fall away from it. Outside, a thin wind scraped across the frozen yard. I stood there until the warmth of the kitchen felt foreign against my skin. Eventually, I reached for my coat and walked back toward the garage. I needed movement. Stillness had started to feel dangerous. Inside, the air felt colder than it had earlier, though nothing in the room had changed. I switched on the lights and watched the shadows retreat slowly across the concrete. The tape recorder sat on the bench where I left it. I turned it so the window of the cassette faced me, then stepped back, unsure of what to do with the warning that had been cut short. That night I opened my laptop. The glow filled the room like a small fire. I searched for answers: Nebraska trust law, land rights, power of attorney, medical capacity standards, legal guardianship petitions. I moved through each topic the way a man sorts through tools in the dark, picking up one, holding it to the light, learning its purpose before setting it down again. I was not preparing to fight anyone, not yet, I needed to understand the ground beneath my feet, the ground my father had tried to protect. Hours passed in the quiet. The only sound was the clicking of keys and the low hum of the heater. At some point, I looked toward the corner where my father's fire safe had stood for decades. The empty space behind its open door felt heavier than any secret spoken aloud. When morning came, the light through the windows was thin and pale. I had not slept. The garage smelled of burnt coffee and cold metal. I washed my face at the sink and let the water run over my hands until they steadied. Work usually grounded me, but even that felt different today. Near noon, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. The voice on the other end introduced himself as Mark Delaney from Heartland Logistics. His tone surprised me. Calm, respectful. No hint of the pressure my brothers had carried into every conversation. He asked if we could talk. He said his company had tried for almost 2 years to get a straight answer about the land. He said every document pointed to me as the legal owner, but every meeting request was intercepted by someone else. He paused, clearing his throat in a way that told me he was choosing his words carefully. We only negotiate with the legal owner, Mr. Warren. And that is you. His voice carried relief. Relief, not persuasion. I told him he could stop by the garage the next afternoon. He said he would. After the call, I let out a breath I did not know I had been holding. Someone was finally speaking to me and not around me. It felt like the first crack of light after a long night. By evening, a brown envelope arrived in my mailbox. Lorraine's handwriting marked the corner. I brought it into the kitchen and opened it at the table. Inside were photocopies. Bank statements, casino debts, signed promissory notes, a payoff agreement from 2005 bearing my father's signature, $1.4 million paid to spare the farm and my brother's freedom. Attached was a small slip of paper in Lorraine's looping script. You needed to see this. I held the documents carefully. Paper has a way of carrying the heat of the hands that touched it before. These pages felt cold, desperate, heavy with a past no one had spoken aloud. Later that week, I found Cole sitting outside the garage on the tailgate of his truck. His shoulders were tense, his jaw set tight in the way young men try to hold themselves together when something has come undone. He told me the guard had pulled him into an administrative review for insubordination. I knew Cole well enough by then to read between the lines. He had questioned someone, likely in defense of someone else. And it had cost him. He looked at the ground when he spoke, as if bracing for judgment. I leaned against the truck beside him. I told him he could work at the garage any time he needed hours or a place to keep busy. His eyes lifted at that. Gratitude can be quiet, like a breath someone holds for too long, finally being released. As winter deepened, I worked long hours repairing machines most shops refused to touch. Old combines, electric lifts, hydraulic cutters. Word spread, ranchers stopped by, then contractors, then the city works manager. The garage that had been fading into the background began to find its purpose again. Not busy, not loud, just steady. I used what money I had to upgrade a few tools, bought a used welding table, replaced the overhead lights, built a simple website with hours and services listed. Nothing flashy, but enough that the garage no longer looked like a quiet afterthought on the edge of town. One afternoon, Jenna stopped by with a stack of files she said I should see. She spoke quietly, glancing toward the windows as though someone might be listening. She had found a deleted email buried in the county system, a request for medical evaluation forms regarding capacity assessment, the kind used in elder law cases, the kind used to argue someone was unfit to make decisions. The sender's name had been scrubbed, but the timestamp placed it months before the funeral. Someone in my family had been laying the groundwork long before they asked for my signature. The realization settled slowly. a cold shape forming just beneath the surface. I thanked Jenna. She reached into her coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and passed it to me. "Take care of yourself, Elias." Her voice held a weight that made me wonder how much she knew and how long she had been holding on to it. The next day, Mark arrived at the garage. His truck was clean, the kind used by men who spent more time in meetings than in fields. He stepped inside, brushed snow from his coat, and looked around the space with the eyes of someone assessing a man before his business. He said 18 months had passed since Heartland began their inquiry. He said every time they tried to meet with the property owner, someone else intercepted the call. He said it took longer than it should have, but they were relieved to finally speak with the man whose name was on the deed. "We have been waiting for the real owner to step forward." His words carried no accusation, only truth, and a certain kind of respect I had not felt from family in a long time. I nodded, a slow exhale escaping without my permission. In that breath lived something small but undeniable, a shift, a quiet reclaiming of ground I had been pushed off of without even noticing. The garage felt warmer than before. Light fell across the workbench in a sob line. Outside, the wind moved past the windows with a steady whisper as if carrying the news across the field. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle in its new shape, knowing the next steps would not wait much longer. The wind pushed against the garage windows that morning, steady and low, like a warning passing through the fields before it reached town. I felt it in my chest long before I stepped outside. Something in the air had shifted again, the way it does when truth is about to scrape against whatever lies have been holding it down. When I closed the shop for the day and locked the door behind me, the metal felt colder than usual under my palm. The VFW sat at the edge of Caldwell, just beyond the rail tracks, its faded brick holding decades of meetings, arguments, and the quiet dignity of men who had carried more than one kind of burden. Tonight its parking lot was full. Trucks lined the gravel, shoulder headlights cutting through the early evening haze. Inside, the familiar scent of burnt coffee and old varnish clung to the air. Rows of folding chairs faced a long table draped with a flag that had seen too many winters. Conversations drifted in low waves until the moment I stepped through the door. Then the room shifted. Words cut off mid-sentence. A few heads turned too quickly. Some looked down at their boots as if the floor had suddenly become interesting. Lorraine walked beside me, her steps quiet but firm, her coat draped over one arm. She carried a folder under the other, the weight of it visible in her grip. A single chair near the front bore a sheet of paper with my name printed in bold letters. Property owner. It sat like a challenge in the middle of the room. I walked toward it, every footstep echoing more than it should have. When I sat, the metal chair cooled through my jacket. Lorraine took her place beside me. She rested her folder on her lap, one hand on top of it. Calm as a woman waiting for a storm she already knew how to weather. Across the room, David stood near the coffee urn, his face pale even in the dim yellow light. Brian hovered at his side, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Neither of them spoke. Neither looked my way. Mark Delaney stepped up to the table and cleared his throat. He had the composed look of a man used to corporate rooms, but his eyes followed the tension in the hall like he was tracking current beneath still water. When he began speaking, his voice carried the steady certainty of someone who had finally reached the right door. "Heartland Logistics will only conduct business with Mr. Warren. That is the beginning and the end of our position." The sentence moved through the hall like a slow wave. Someone inhaled sharply. Someone else whispered something under their breath. Mark glanced around the room as if giving everyone a chance to let the words settle. I felt both brothers look at me then, a pressure sharp and quick like a sudden shift of wind. David's jaw tightened until his lips thinned into a straight line. Brian looked as if he wanted to melt into the shadows along the back wall. Lorraine rose slowly, her folder tucked under one arm. She walked toward the front of the room, each step measured and deliberate. When she reached the table, she opened the folder without looking down. She had prepared for this moment long before any of us entered the building. Her voice stayed calm as she presented the evidence. Forged copies of land documents, missing originals from the county archives, email correspondence linking David to an elder law attorney known for capacity challenges, the kind used to argue that a man could not be trusted with the same decisions he had been making his entire life. Gasps broke from the crowd. Not dramatic, just human. People shifted in their seats. Someone muttered the words "unbelievable." Another whispered that they had suspected something was wrong all along. Mark lifted his hand, his expression tightening with a kind of quiet authority. "This project is suspended until the ownership conflict is resolved." He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at my brothers. The silence that followed felt colder than the winter air outside. Brian's breath shook as he stepped forward. "David told me it would stay quiet. I only signed what he put in front of me." He stared at the floor while speaking, as if the truth was too heavy to look at head on. His voice cracked on the last word. When he finished, he sank back a step, shoulders slumping inward. David said nothing. His face had gone a strange color, neither pale nor flushed, something caught between anger and fear. He opened his mouth twice, but no words came. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "Elias, you do not understand what you are doing." I met his gaze. I felt the weight of every year between us. The choices made in the dark, the trust buried under silence. "I did not trap you. You dug this hole yourselves." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. It held its place in the middle of the room, unshaken by the confusion and betrayal swirling around it. The meeting dissolved after that. People gathered their coats, whispering to each other as they drifted toward the exit. Chairs scraped against the floor, the lights flickered once overhead. I stood and let the noise of movement pass me without stepping into it. Outside, the cold hit hard. The sky held the color of iron, the last light of the day sinking behind the grain elevator. I walked toward the hallway that led to the parking lot. The old wood creaked under my boots. David waited there, leaning against the wall like a man bracing for a blow. When I passed him, he spoke, his voice low and hard. The words pulled tight from somewhere deep inside him. "You have no idea what door you just opened." The hallway was narrow. The air felt still. His eyes searched my face for something he could hold on to. Some piece of the past that might save him. I did not answer. There was nothing to say that would not make the wound deeper. I stepped past him and felt the cold air rush in from the exit as I pushed the door open. Behind me, the hall fell silent again. Ahead, the parking lot lights cast long shadows across the gravel, stretching toward the road like paths waiting to be walked. I kept walking, letting the night take the sound of the meeting behind me, leaving only the truth standing where it needed to stand. The gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped away from the VFW hall. The cold settled deeper into the night, the kind that bites through layers and finds whatever is already fragile inside a man. Headlights swept across the parking lot as trucks pulled out one by one, but I kept walking until their lights disappeared behind me. The road stretched ahead, empty and silent, and the only thing that moved in that silence was the weight of everything spoken in that room. By the time I reached the garage, the sky had darkened fully. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The familiar hum of the overhead lights flickered to life, washing the concrete floor in that pale blue tint that made every shadow sharper. I set my coat on the hook. My hands were still stiff from the cold, but it did not stop me from clearing a space on the workbench as if I needed the room to breathe. Sleep never came that night. I lay on the cot in the back office, staring at the ceiling while the wind rattled the side door. Thoughts turned over slowly, heavy as stones. Dad's voice on that broken tape fragment. David's anger. Brian's fear, the empty fire safe. All of it forming a picture I still could not fully see. At dawn, my phone buzzed. The alert cut through the stillness. I reached for it without sitting up. Jenna had sent a file. No message. No explanation. Just a digital attachment with a date that made my pulse hit hard once. 2008. I sat up slowly. The garage was still half dark, the lights not yet warmed to their full brightness. I opened the file. Static cracked for a second. Then I heard the voice I had spent years trying not to miss. My father's voice, clear in a way that hollowed out the air around me. He said he had not put the land in my name because I was the strongest. He said he did it because I was the one who would never turn it into a weapon against my brothers. The words echoed through the garage, filling every empty space. They carried no anger, no resentment, only a weary kind of hope, the kind men speak when they know their time is shorter than they admit. I listened with my elbows on my knees, my hands laced together, my breath lodged somewhere deep. I played the recording again, then again. The concrete beneath me blurred as tears fell, small dark spots widening slowly like water dropped onto dry earth. I did not wipe them away. There are moments in a man's life when the truth deserves its own place, and this was one of them. When the tape ended, silence filled the room in a different shape than before, not empty, not lonely, something closer to clarity, a thin strand of truth tying past and present into a line I could finally follow. By evening, I found myself driving toward the old roadside bar off Highway 34. The kind of place where neon lights beat faintly against the windows and the air inside always smelled of fried onions and spilled beer. David had texted earlier asking to talk. I did not answer. But I came anyway. I parked and sat there for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel. The bar signs flickered red, then blue across the hood of my truck. When I finally stepped inside, the sound of clinking glasses and low voices wrapped around me like a blanket too worn to give real warmth. David sat at the far end of the bar, his shoulders hunched forward, his hands wrapped around a glass he had barely touched. When he looked up, something in his eyes shifted the way a man's gaze shifts when he knows the ground under him has started to crumble. He spoke first, his voice roughened by exhaustion. "I know you heard the recording." I nodded. He swallowed hard, staring down at his hands, fingers tightening around the glass. "I spent years resenting you. Mom trusted you more, Dad worked beside you. You never needed anything, not from them, not from me." His voice trembled as he tried to keep it steady. There was something small and broken in the way he said the next words. "I hated that you did not need what I needed." I let the silence hold for a moment. Then I answered, my voice quiet, steady in the way truth can sometimes steadier a man. The land was never the inheritance. The lesson was. He closed his eyes halfway as if the words struck something he had been avoiding his entire life. When he looked up again, he did not try to defend himself. He did not argue. Shame had settled over him in a way that softened the edges of his face, making him look younger and older at the same time. He tried to speak again, his lips parting as if he could shape an apology into something that might mend the years between us. But his eyes slid away from mine, unable to meet the truth hanging between us. That hesitation, that small collapse of courage, told me more than any confession could have. I stood slowly. The bar lights cast long shadows across the floor as I pushed my chair back. David's hand twitched as if he wanted to reach out but could not bring himself to do it. I placed a few bills on the counter for the untouched drinks and stepped back. Outside, the air had grown sharper. The road stretched before me, quiet under the last trace of evening light. I paused beside my truck, letting the cold settle against my skin, letting the night breathe around me. Behind me, through the bar's door, laughter rose briefly, then fell again. life going on indifferent to whatever truths had surfaced in a dim corner booth. I looked down at my hands. They no longer shook. The recording had cut through whatever doubt lingered in me, leaving something steadier, something I had not felt in years, a truth that no one could refute. A choice my father made with clarity. A reason that had finally come to light. I opened the truck door and let the engine rumble awake. As I pulled onto the highway, the bar's neon signs faded behind me, replaced by the long stretch of road leading toward home. The silence in the cab felt different now. Weighted but clean, a space where a man could hear his own thoughts without fear of what they might reveal. Somewhere in the distance, the fields lay dark and wide, holding the land my father had trusted me to protect. I drove toward them, the recording still echoing faintly in the back of my mind, each word falling into place like pieces of a truth finally restored. And as the lights of town came into view, I felt something settle deep inside me, quiet but certain, a knowing that whatever came next would rise from this moment. Quiet, honest, unshaken. The night after I left the roadside bar, the cold settled deeper across Caldwell. By morning, the frost had built a thin silver edge along the garage windows, tracing lines like a quiet warning from the weather itself. I switched on the lights and stood in the middle of the shop for a long moment, listening to the slow hum of the heaters waking up. My father's voice still moved somewhere under my ribs, steady as a heartbeat. I had almost forgotten the rhythm of. The morning passed uneventfully until I saw Mark's truck turn into the lot. Snow dusted the hood, gathering in the corners of the windshield. He stepped out with a boulder in his hand and an expression that carried both purpose and something like hesitation. I could tell he had rehearsed his words long before knocking on the bay door. Inside, he brushed snow from his coat and took in the garage the way a man tries to understand the room before he speaks. We sat at the workbench. He opened the folder and laid the papers out carefully, each sheet aligned as if accuracy could soften whatever weight he was about to hand me. He explained the offer slowly, making sure I understood every angle. A 6-figure role on their operations team, decision-making authority, a majority share of the profit. He said it was compensation for the delay and for the mess my brothers had dragged the company through. As he spoke, his voice remained calm, but a faint edge of uncertainty hid just beneath it. Even he seemed aware that the offer was larger than anything a one-man garage owner in Caldwell usually saw. I listened. The numbers sat on the page quietly, almost politely, as if waiting to see whether I would reach for them. For a moment I did imagine it. A different life, a newer truck, a house without sagging floorboards, a savings account my father would have been proud of. Then the imagining faded. The pages in front of me began to feel like something with too many strings attached. I asked for time. Mark nodded, though his eyes broke from mine for a second, revealing the disappointment he did not speak aloud. He gathered the loose sheets back into the folder but left it on the bench. Before he stepped out into the cold, he looked around the garage again. His gaze settled on the tools hanging on the wall. "You have built something steady here," he said softly. Then he left, and the door shut behind him with a quiet thud. Snow thickened through the afternoon. I kept working until the day dimmed into a sitter shade of gray, then locked the bay and switched off the lights. The world outside was muffled by the storm wind pushing the flakes sideways across the lot. I had just pulled my coat tighter when headlights swept the front of the shop. Brian stepped out of his truck, his shoulders hunched against the wind. Snow clung to his hair, melting into small beads along his brow. His steps were uneven, the gait of a man who had rehearsed a speech he was not sure he could finish. He stood in the middle of the garage with his arms tucked into his coat, breathing hard from the cold. He started speaking before he had fully steadied himself. His voice cracked in the middle. We need you to save the deal. Save the family. He tried to smile, but it wavered, collapsing almost immediately. Behind his eyes was something frantic, and beneath that, something hollow. I asked him the question that had followed me like a shadow for years. If I had nothing to give, would you be here? He froze, his breath caught in his chest. I watched the truth move through him slowly, the way cold slips under a door. His eyes dropped to the floor, then lifted, then dropped again. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. When he finally spoke, his voice barely reached me. I do not know. Those 4 words were heavier than anything else he could have said. He turned toward the door as if the cold outside might be kinder than the silence between us. When he reached the threshold, he paused, his shivering hand on the frame, and said something about making things right. But the wind carried most of it away. Then he stepped into the snow and closed the door behind him. The silence that followed him out was sharp enough to sting. Later, long after I had shut down the shop for the night, my phone lit up with a message from David. The truck was still cold when I opened it. His words appeared on the screen slowly, as if he had typed them with a trembling hand. I do not deserve forgiveness, but I want a chance to earn it. For a moment, I let the phone rest against the steering wheel. Snow tapped against the windshield. His message sank into me the way heavy truth does. I did not respond, not out of anger, out of caution. The wound was still too open for words to hold steady. The next morning, I drove to Lorraine's house. Her porch smelled faintly of cedar and old winters. She let me in without asking questions and set coffee on the table. I told her about the offer, about Brian in the storm, about David's late-night message. She listened without interruption, her fingers lightly touching the rim of her mug. When I finished, she folded her hands and looked at me with the eyes of someone who had seen too many families tear themselves apart for less. With the evidence we have, you could take both of them to court. Their accounts would be frozen by morning. You would win everything. Her tone held no pressure, only truth, the kind that forces a man to decide who he is, not just what he wants. I looked down at the calluses on my hands, the small scars etched from years of work. My father had trusted me with the land because I would not use it to hurt my brothers. If I chose the route Lorraine laid out, even if I won, I would become the very thing he feared they might become. I told her I did not want ashes, I wanted clarity. Lorraine nodded once, slow and approving, as if she had been waiting for those words. When I left her house, the sky had cleared. The snow on the fields glowed under the sun, unbroken and clean. I drove back to town with a steadiness I had not felt in days. Mark met me at the garage that evening. His breath fogged the air as he stepped inside. He looked at me with a mixture of expectation and respect. I gave him my answer. I would support the project. I would sign the documents as the legal owner. But I would not take the job, not the money, not the position that would lift me out of the life I chose. He blinked once, surprised, then nodded slowly. The disappointment was real, but so was the respect that settled in right after. I thanked him. My place is here, I said, fixing what is broken with my own hands. After he left, the garage grew quiet again. The sun dipped low, slipping behind the edge of the grain elevator. A soft line of gold stretched across the workbench, warming the wood and the metal tools my father once touched. I stood in that light until it faded, letting the weight of the decision settle into me like a final breath before stepping forward into whatever waited next. The cold morning settled around me as I stepped outside, a sun blue light touching the field that used to stretch farther than the eye could follow. 12 acres remained now, the portion I kept for myself, for Mom and Dad, for whatever quiet part of me still needed a place to stand without being asked to choose a side. Frost clung to the grass in thin silver threads. The air tasted still, as if waiting for something to breathe life into it. I walked the fence line slowly. The land looked different after everything that had happened, lighter somehow, as if the old weight had finally slid off and settled somewhere behind me. I stopped near the oak tree that marked the edge of the garden I had imagined for months. Lavender would fill this space when spring warmed the ground. Mom used to dry bundles of it in the kitchen window, the whole house smelling like calm. I could almost see her hands brushing the stems. Cole arrived just after sunrise, boots thudding sfeely on the ground. He carried a box of tools and a thermos tucked under his arm. He said the soil looked ready and asked where I wanted to start. His voice had a steadiness to it, a quiet understanding that came from someone who had watched things fall apart and decided to help rebuild anyway. I nodded to the stretch of earth nearest the tree. He set his things down and began clearing the ground, and I joined him. We worked without speaking for a long time, the sky slowly turning gold as the sun climbed. When the first row was ready, we planted the young lavender together, spacing each plant by hand. Cold soil pressed against my palms, and for a moment I felt a strange warmth move through me, a heaviness loosening from somewhere I had carried it too long. Dad's old bench sat a few yards away, the wood worn soft from years of use. I had sanded it earlier that week and brushed on a clear coat to save what was left. It waited there like it had always been part of the land's truth. By midday, the garden had shape, not finished but breathing. Cole wiped his hands on his jeans and said I should leave the rest for tomorrow. I looked at him standing there, young and restless but grounded in a way I recognized. I told him the bench was his if he ever needed a place to sit and figure things out. He gave a short laugh and shook his head, but I saw the meaning land in his eyes before he walked back toward his truck. In the afternoon, I went back to the garage. Snow had started again, flakes drifting slow and light, catching the air like pale feathers. I swept the floor and cleaned the tools on the bench, letting the rhythm of familiar work anchor me. The shop had always been where I returned when life felt too loud. Now it felt like a place I could finally breathe without watching my back. The door rattled once in the wind, and I paused to listen, wondering how long it would take for the noise inside me to match the calm around me. By evening, the snow thickened, muffling the sounds of the town. Lights from the passing highway cast a soft glow through the front windows. I was wiping down a carburetor when headlights swept across the shop wall. A truck rolled slowly into the driveway, tires crunching in the fresh snow. I set the rag down and walked to the door, the cold pressing in as soon as I opened it. David and Brian stood there, both bundled in heavy coats, snow dusting their shoulders. They held foil-covered dishes between them, hands trembling in the cold. Or maybe it was not the cold. Brian shifted his weight and removed his cap. His voice started to form words but faltered. David stepped closer, eyes lowered as if unsure he deserved to stand that close. He spoke first, barely louder than the wind. "Elias, come home for dinner." The words hung between us, fragile and unsteady. I studied their faces, the tired lines, the raw edge of something like regret, and maybe the first signs of understanding. There was no certainty in their eyes, only a quiet hope that felt new. Not the old expectation that I would fall in line, not the push and pull of obligation, just an honest request. I asked where the rest of the family was. Brian said everyone was waiting, but that the table would not be set until I walked through the door. His voice cracked on the last few words. Snow gathered on his lashes before he blinked it away. For a moment I felt the old ache rise in me, that familiar fear of returning to a place that had once asked too much and given too little. But then I saw the way David held the dish with both hands, knuckles white, as if holding something fragile enough to break. I saw how his shoulders slumped, not in defeat but in humility. Something in me eased. I glanced back into the shop. The warm yellow light touched the tools on the wall, the workbench, the small radio in the corner. This place had saved me in its own quiet way, but life was not meant to be lived with doors closed forever. I reached for the light switch and turned it off, letting the darkness settle gently around the room. When I stepped outside, the cold wrapped around me, clean and honest. David breathed out in a long, shaky exhale. Brian gave a small nod, almost a bow. They stepped aside as I walked toward the truck. The snow kept falling soft and slow, the kind that makes the world seem quieter than it is. As I climbed into the passenger seat, I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but the space where forgiveness might learn to grow. The engine rumbled to life, steady and low. We pulled away from the shop tires, carving 2 fresh lines through the untouched snow. Outside the window, the lavender field waited under the blanket of winter, resting until the thaw. The thought settled into me like a promise. Some men are not quiet because they have nothing to say. Some men stay quiet because they finally understand what is worth speaking and when.